These days is difficult to say the least. There is a devastating war going on. Independent journalists aren't allowed in, and for our purposes on this program, there's no official economic data. But what information we do have points to a war economy, money and food supplies being kept aside for the government, the army and its supporters. So we're going to try to pull together some of the information available to give us a slightly better picture this week. Before the crisis, the Syrian economy was worth about $60 billion. There used to be a budget deficit of between 3 and 5% of gross domestic product. But in 2013, the forecast is for a budget deficit of 745 billion Syrian pounds. That's about $10 billion, which is more than a sixth of GDP. And here's some other things we know from the budget unveiled by the finance minister, Mohammed Jalati. Next year's budget's actually been increased 4% to almost $20 billion. Public sector salaries will go up 13% in effort to keep things afloat, keep some people happy. And there'll be a 25% boost in subsidies on food, energy and agriculture. Trouble is, none of this takes into account Syria's plunging oil revenues. So we're going to discuss the ins and outs of a war economy in just a moment. First, though, this report from Kristen Salumi, based on documents obtained by Al Jazeera, which show who's been backing President Bashar al-Assad with the cash and how.
After nearly 2 years of conflict, Syria appears to have become a cash economy. And there seems to be no shortage of it, despite falling oil and tax revenues and rising costs. This may be why. Records obtained by the investigative website ProPublica document 8 flights between Moscow and Damascus. The cargo, Syrian banknotes. In total, 240 tons of them.
We're talking about billions of dollars going into being printed in a very short period of time. Most of the flights that we tracked occurred in a 2-week period at the beginning of September.
The Russian government will not confirm what was on board this Syrian plane, photographed by aviation enthusiasts in Moscow. But the date of the photos coincides with the date of the logs for the flights carrying the money.
So it's prolonging the longevity of this regime and its ability to survive. Financial aspects of that are very, very important because they essentially buy support. They can keep the military intact, keep its supply coming in somehow.
Records show the plane flew over Azerbaijan, Iran and Iraq, completely avoiding Turkish airspace. A former Russian diplomat says it was a perfectly legal business transaction.
The Security Council doesn't take any steps to blockade Syria economically. It is absolutely one-sided decision of the United States, and some nations, some states joined these American efforts.
Syria's currency used to be printed in Austria, but European Union sanctions put an end to that deal.
I think we've been very clear, both publicly and privately, how we feel about any country, Russia included, supporting the Assad regime in any way.
The cost of goods are expected to increase with the infusion of new money. Inflation is already estimated to be between 40 and 65%. And as costs rise, it is the Syrian people, already suffering from the violence, who will feel the sanctions' impact.
The value and the purchasing power and the real incomes of Syrians will be just falling and falling and falling with these very high rates of inflation. And I presume from the opposition side of the Assad regime, they would be seeing that as hopefully domestic pressure on Assad to go as people's living conditions just take a turn for the worse.
Having a steady supply of cash will allow the Assad government to continue paying its workers, most crucially, its soldiers.
And then there's the flip side, people suffering from the war who really need the kind of money and support that the Syrian government appears to have. Because while there have been plenty of promises of aid from international donors, there's just not enough. Take Idlib province, which has seen its first delivery of aid. But as correspondent Sue Turton found out for herself there, it's just a trickle when a torrent is what's really needed.
Sugar, tea, baby formula and wheat. The first shipment of aid to get to the mountains of Idlib province since this conflict began. But it's a pitiful amount. 10,000 families live in this region, and another 8,000 who fled the bombing in Marat al-Nauman are also sheltering here.
We've heard a lot of promises from humanitarian organizations, and we believe these promises. But we haven't seen anything on the ground. We say to a world that claims to be democratic and cares about humanity, where are your principles now? They are worthless.
Dr. Hani Maroof collects some of the aid for his town.
How long will that keep a child with milk?
It depends on the age of the baby. If you're 10 days old, it's can for about 1 week.
He's also given money to buy children's medicines. According to the receipt, it was donated by France. He says they desperately need diesel for heating and to bake bread. Without these basics, people will die here this winter. That's if the government fighter jets circling overhead don't bomb their homes first. 2 days after we left, 4 rockets landed here. All the aid coming into Idlib province comes through the border crossing at Bab al-Hawa.
You'd expect a convoy of trucks carrying all sorts of aid, but so far it's been just a trickle. In fact, the Turkish government's disaster zone unit described the foreign aid donated so far as irrelevant and symbolic.
In one refugee camp close to the Turkish border, Ahmad Ibrahim has blood poisoning. He needs a transfusion every 10 days. The doctor's very little medicine or equipment to help boys like Ahmed or women like Latifa. She has breast cancer and desperately needs chemotherapy.
There's nowhere here. I can't afford to go to Turkey, and the road to Damascus is cut off.
The NGO Save the Children is warning of a $200 million shortfall, but that's just for refugees outside of Syria. For inside the country, the international community has pledged hundreds of millions of dollars, but only half the money has actually arrived.
About 208 organizations came here. They filmed and asked us questions. They left and we haven't seen or heard from them since. We have just a trickle of medicines.
Time is fast running out for thousands of Syrians. They've survived 20 months of conflict. Can they survive a winter with scarce heating, food and medicines?
So lots to discuss when it comes to the Syrian economy right now, and we're going to do that with Jihad Yazigi. He's joining us via Skype from Beirut, editor-in-chief of the Syria Report, which provides economic news and data on the country, and we thank you for your time. Take me back first, if you would, before the wars started. We're going back, the best part of 2 years now. What sort of state was the Syrian economy actually in back then? Was it strong? Was it self-reliant?
Well, the Syrian economy had been growing for several consecutive years at growth rates of around 4 to 5%, which is by Western standards very often estimated as a relatively good level of GDP growth. In practice, however, this growth was not sufficient to create enough employment for large segments of the population. It was an economy that was liberalizing, which was opening up to private investment, but unfortunately, which was not caring enough to large segments of the population, in particular, the segments of the population that live in the rural areas or in the suburbs of the large cities, exactly the same people who today are in the streets.
And how quickly, Jihad, did it fall apart, basically?
Well, the economy actually, one of the strengths of the Syrian economy is its diversity. It is an economy that has which has, a significant output in agriculture, in manufacturing, in the services sector, in oil, and so on and so forth. And this has helped the economy sustain itself for quite a long period of time. To this day, the fact that you have had 2 years of good crops has enabled the government to put a lid on inflation and to ensure relatively good supplies of food products in the major urban centers. So it's an economy that has, if you want, contracted gradually. Now we are starting to feel a much more severe impact, actually.
Yeah, well, tell me more about that severe impact and also how you get the information out, because information is very limited coming out of Syria.
Indeed, it is scarce. We haven't had any data published on any macroeconomic indicator since May 2011, except for inflation, actually. So we have no idea, for instance, of the level of foreign currency reserves. Basically, the economy has begun to deteriorate very seriously this summer the expansion of violence to Damascus and then to the suburbs of Aleppo to Aleppo and to the suburbs of Damascus has led to a severe contraction in manufacturing output. Add to this the fact that the government has been spending most of its remaining reserves, apparently. The fact that you have had now 2 years in a row where you have no tourists, where you have no foreign investment, where you have no spending. So all of this all these factors have combined to lead to the situation where we are today, which is a situation of very severe contraction, of a high inflation rate, and of the strong devaluation of the Syrian pound.
And it gives rise, doesn't it, to a war economy, effectively. And there's so many aspects of that. It becomes a cash-based society. We start talking about the sides, where they're getting funds from. The Russians are funding the Syrian government. There's talk of that. There's, who's funding the rebels and all that. It changes the whole dynamic of a country's economy.
Absolutely. To a certain extent, we can say that in large segments of the country, we are talking today of a subsistence economy. We do not have to forget that you have many border posts that are not under control of the government. You have areas under control of the government, others under control of the FSA, others under control of the Kurds. You have areas such as the coastal area, which have been spared from most of the violence. Others like Aleppo or Deir ez-Zor, where you can't talk of an economy, actually, because they're under bombing. You have kidnappings, you have lootings that are all new forms of trade. So having a clear picture of the Syrian economy today is extremely complicated. You have actually different Syrian economies to a certain extent. Now, you continue to have a state which continues to supply services, to pay salaries. Services are supplied in many urban centers, but in most rural areas, basically people are left alone to a large extent, or have to rely on either war economy or new business networks. Actually,
let's just get a quick thought from you about rebuilding the economy. I've seen Syrian opposition calling for about $60 billion needed for rebuilding. I mean, we'll never know. With this much damage there's been, the infrastructure must be in a shocking state. That's a knock-on effect towards commerce, business, all these sorts of things. The rebuilding is going to be extraordinary.
Absolutely. We are talking of billions of dollars. Luckily, many of the largest industrial concerns, such as the refineries or the power plants, have not been damaged to large extents. At least that's what I know for the moment. Now, I think one of the major issue when we are going to talk about the reconstruction will be that we will need to be extremely transparent. As you said, we don't really know what the amount is at this time, which is normal. But the more important thing is that when money will be poured in, we have to make sure that it goes to long-term projects, that it is well spent, that corruption is as little as possible, that people are being held accountable, because after all, the people who are going to pay back this money to donors are the Syrian people. They need to be involved in that process.
Jihad Azizi from the Syrian Report. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for your time.
Thanks to you.
We want to look at Spain.